A great fortune does not merely buy comfort. It buys a private courtroom around every member of the family, a private courtroom that meets in dining rooms and inquest halls and police chiefs' offices, a courtroom whose verdict is rendered long before a jury ever sees the case. When a husband or wife inside that fortune kills, the question that decides the rest of their life is not whether the law believes their story. It is whether the family's quiet machinery of butlers and doctors and old friends will close around them in time. 3 marriages, 3 deaths, 3 verdicts the world was never allowed to deliver. If you enjoy the stories the polite histories left out, hit subscribe and stay with me, because the names in this video lived inside fortunes built to outlast every question they ever raised. Chapter 1. The Widow. With £40,000 of her own, Florence Campbell was 27 years old, widowed and rich in her own right when she stopped being a respectable problem and started being a respectable prize. She had been born in Buenos Aires in 1845, the daughter of a wealthy Australian merchant and pastoralist named Robert Campbell. Her childhood was passed across 2 continents and a sea of servants, and her education was the education of a young woman who would never need to work, but would always need to marry well. She married at 19. Her husband was Captain Alexander Louis Ricardo of the Grenadier Guards, an officer of good family, a handsome face on the parade ground, and a drinker of catastrophic proportions. The wedding gift from her father was a settlement of around £40,000, a sum equivalent today to several million pounds, placed in trust for her use and protection. The marriage failed quickly. Captain Ricardo drank through the cavalry mess, drank through the regiments, drank through the country house parties, and at last drank through his own constitution. He died in Cologne in 1871 at the age of 28. The death certificate said acute alcoholism. The Times said simply that he had passed away after a short illness. Florence was 26 years old, a widow, and very rich. She did not behave the way Victorian society expected her to. She did not retreat into mourning. She did not bury herself in charitable work and slow remarriage. She moved to Malvern, a fashionable hydrotherapy resort, and she placed herself under the care of Dr. James Manby Gully, who at the time was perhaps the most famous physician in England. Gully was 54 when Florence arrived. He was the proprietor of the Great Water Cure establishment at Malvern, a published author on hydrotherapy, a friend of Charles Dickens and Florence Nightingale, and a man whose reputation for warmth toward female patients was already a private joke in medical circles. He had treated Tennyson. He had treated Darwin. He treated Florence Ricardo with a closeness that crossed every line that Victorian medicine had drawn. She moved into a cottage near his establishment. He visited her every day. Within a year they were lovers. Within 2 years she had become pregnant. In 1873, by the account of her own later confessor, Dr. Gully performed an abortion on her. Her family discovered the affair and intervened. Her parents threatened to cut her off. She broke with Gully formally, though they continued to correspond. She moved to a substantial villa in the suburb of Balham, south of the river in London. The Priory, as it was called, sat in its own grounds with a stable block, a carriage drive, and a household staff of around 10. She brought with her a companion, a widow called Jane Cannon Cox, whose 3 sons were being privately educated on the strength of Florence's allowance. Jane Cox knew every line of Florence's story. She also knew that her own family's future depended on Florence's continued solvency. It was at this moment, in 1874, that the law itself shifted under her feet. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 had only recently come into force. For the first time in English history, a married woman could retain her own earnings and her own personal property without it becoming her husband's at the altar rail. Florence's first marriage had concluded under the older rules, but those rules had also given her a settlement that was hers, and her widowhood had restored the full force of her ownership over it. She was, in financial terms, the unusual case. She was a wealthy single woman in her late 20s with an income of around £4,000 a year, equivalent to roughly £400,000 today, the legal right to dispose of every penny of it, and no man to answer to. The men of her acquaintance noticed. In the autumn of 1875, Jane Cox introduced her to a young barrister called Charles Delany Turner Bravo. He was 30 years old, ambitious, well-connected, and, by his own quiet account, in need of a financial settlement that would let him expand his practice. He was the stepson of a wealthy Jewish merchant called Joseph Bravo, but his prospects from that quarter were limited. Florence Ricardo, by contrast, was a complete proposition. Within weeks of meeting her, Charles Bravo had proposed. She accepted. She wrote to Dr. Gully and told him she was breaking with him formally and finally. She had decided, she told her sister, to give herself a respectable life. She would marry a barrister, take her place in suburban society, and never again be the subject of medical gossip in Malvern. The decision was made before she understood the price. Chapter 2. The Barrister Who Wanted Her Cottage. Charles Bravo proposed to Florence in October 1875 and almost immediately began renegotiating her marriage settlement, sentence by sentence. His first request was that she transfer her cottage at Buscoe in Berkshire to him outright. The Buscott property had been a small refuge during her widowhood, and Florence valued it. She had purchased it from a relative. It was income-producing in a modest way. Charles wanted it in his name. He argued that a husband should have visible property of his own. She agreed to discuss it. She did not yet agree to transfer it. His second request was that she dismiss Jane Cox. Charles disliked the companion's influence and disliked, more particularly, what she knew. Jane Cox had been present through the Malvern years. Jane Cox had attended Florence during her illness in 1873. Jane Cox kept the household running. Charles told Florence that no respectable household could be run by a widow with 3 sons of her own and no proper position. Florence refused. The refusal was the first warning sign of how this marriage would go. His third request, and the most consequential, concerned the running of the household budget. He proposed that Florence's annual income from her settlement be paid into a joint account from which he, as the head of the household, would draw. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 did not prevent this. It only prevented him from claiming her capital as of right. She agreed in principle. She did not agree in writing. They were married on the 7th of December, 1875, at All Saints Church in Buscott. The reception was at her cottage. The cake was extravagant. Her sister wept. The honeymoon was abroad. By the time they returned to the Priory in January 1876, the marriage was already arguing. Florence had 2 miscarriages in the first months. Each was treated by her family doctor, a small man called George Harrison, who saw her through the immediate medical management and noted in his casebook the patient's nervous condition and increasing reliance on sherry at all hours. Charles was sympathetic in the first weeks, and then irritated. He believed his wife was using her illness as a means of escaping his demands. He returned more sharply to the question of the Buscott cottage. He returned more sharply to the question of Jane Cox. He began reading Florence's correspondence. He found a letter from Dr. Gully. He confronted her with it. She told him the truth, or some of it. She told him there had been a friendship at Malvern. She told him the friendship had ended. She did not tell him about the pregnancy or the abortion. Charles believed her. Then he stopped believing her. Then he began watching the Post. The dinner table at the Priory became a stage on which their marriage's collapse was performed for the household staff. The cook noted the silences. The parlor maid noted the raised voices. The butler, an experienced man called Frederick Rowe, kept his counsel. Jane Cox kept hers. By March 1876, Charles was speaking openly of selling Florence's London horses to reduce expenditure. By April, he was speaking openly of moving her capital into government bonds under his own management. On the evening of the 17th of April, the night before the poisoning, the cook later testified that there had been a quiet argument in the drawing room, and that Mr. and Mrs. Bravo had taken dinner together with Mrs. Cox. Mr. Bravo had drunk a glass of Burgundy. He had asked about the horses. He had spoken of Buscott. Florence had said little. After dinner, she had gone to bed early. Charles had remained in the drawing-room with Jane Cox. By 10:30, the household was asleep. The antimony was in the stables. It was in the stables because Victorian carriage horses were routinely dosed with tartar emetic for parasites. Every household with carriages kept a supply. The Priory had 4 horses, 2 stable hands, and a coachman called George Griffith, who managed the supplies. He knew where the antimony was. So did Jane Cox. So did Florence. So, in all likelihood, did Charles himself. That was the household. That was the dinner. That was the night. Chapter 3. The antimony in the stables. On the night of the 18th of April, 1876, Charles Bravo went to bed at the Priory and woke at 9:30 with the taste of metal in his mouth. He stood up from the bed. He vomited into the basin in the corner of the bedroom. He called for Florence. He called for the housekeeper. He told them he had been poisoned. The household sent for Dr. Harrison. Harrison sent for a more senior man, called Dr. George Johnson. Johnson sent for Sir William Gull, the most distinguished physician in London. By the morning of the 19th of April, there were 3 doctors in the bedroom, and Charles Bravo was dying. He took 3 days to die. Antimony poisoning does not kill cleanly. The first hours produce violent gastric distress. The second day produces a brief deceptive recovery. The third day produces the final collapse as the kidneys fail. Across those 3 days, Charles was repeatedly asked who had poisoned him. He said he did not know. He said he had taken some laudanum for a toothache. He did not accuse his wife. He did not accuse Jane Cox. He did not accuse Dr. Gully. He said he had taken something himself, and he did not know what. He died on the morning of the 21st of April, 1876, at the age of 30. The first inquest, held at the Priory itself on the 25th of April, was a quiet affair. Florence's family had retained a senior solicitor. The proceedings were short. The jury returned an open verdict, finding that Charles Bravo had died of antimony poisoning, but unable to determine whether the poison had been administered by himself, by accident, or by another person. The press paid limited attention. Florence retreated into mourning. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. Public attention had begun to settle on the case, and the Daily Telegraph in particular had begun asking why a 30-year-old barrister in good health had taken antimony into his own bed. Letters appeared in the papers from doctors arguing that the original inquest had been incompetent. Questions were asked in Parliament. By June 1876, the Home Office had instructed a second inquest, this time before a coroner of national reputation and a jury of London tradesmen, to be held in public. The second inquest opened on the 11th of July, 1876, at the Bedford Hotel in Balham. It sat for 23 days across 5 weeks. The London press attended in force. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Pall Mall Gazette, and the illustrated weeklies sent reporters every day. The room was packed. The witnesses included Florence Bravo, Jane Cox, Dr. James Manby Gully, every servant at the Priory, every doctor who had attended the dying man, the coachman, the stable hands, the family solicitor, and the Bravo family's representatives. The case that emerged was complete in every respect except its conclusion. Florence's affair with Gully was given in detail. The pregnancy was alluded to. The financial disputes within the marriage were laid out. The presence of the antimony in the stables was confirmed. The opportunity of every member of the household to access the antimony was confirmed. The motive of every member of the household was canvassed. Florence Bravo's motive was the financial pressure of her husband. Jane Cox's motive was the survival of her companion's solvency. Dr. Gully's motive was the recovery of his lost lover. Charles Bravo's own motive, if he had taken the poison himself, was a mystery. The verdict, delivered on the 11th of August, 1876, was a careful construction. The jury found that Charles Bravo had died of antimony, that he had not taken it himself, and that he had been willfully murdered by a person or persons unknown. They declined to name Florence. They declined to name Jane Cox. They declined to name Dr. Gully. The director of public prosecutions declined to bring charges. Florence Bravo left the Priory within weeks. She moved to Southsea. She drank more heavily than at any other point in her life. She died there on the 17th of September, 1878, at the age of 33. The death certificate said, acute alcoholism. Jane Cox returned to Jamaica and lived another 23 years. Dr. Gully retired from medicine. Charles Bravo's family were left with an unanswered question that has now been carried for 150 years. That is the first verdict the world was never allowed to deliver. The second was about to be prepared 79 years later, on the other side of an ocean, in a country that did not yet exist when Florence Bravo took her seat at the Bedford Hotel. Chapter 4. The Chorus Girl Who Married Belair. Angeline Crowell of Kansas City spent 10 years rehearsing the woman she would become before she ever met the family that would refuse to accept her. She was born in 1915 to a streetcar conductor and his wife in a working-class district of Kansas City. Her father drank. Her mother sewed. The family budget was the family disaster. By the time she was 16, Angeline had decided that her face was the only resource available to her, and she intended to use it. She dyed her hair. She lost the Kansas accent. She read magazines on charm. She left for Chicago and then for New York at the age of 19. In New York, she became Eve Curtis, then Anne Eden, then a chorus girl in the Fitzpatrick Chorus at the Fitzpatrick Hotel, and at last a radio actress for one of the smaller dramatic productions of the late 1930s. The voice she developed on radio was the voice she would carry into the rest of her life, clipped, precise, faintly mid-Atlantic, the kind of voice that came from training rather than birth. She was beautiful in the way that the era prized, slim, blonde, glacial, photogenic. She made the rounds of the better Manhattan nightclubs. She allowed herself to be seen. In 1942, William Woodward Junior came home on leave. He was a lieutenant in the United States Navy, serving in the Pacific Theater. He was 27 years old. He was Harvard. He was Groton. He was the only son of William Woodward Sr., the chairman of Hanover National Bank, and his wife, Elsie Cryder Woodward, who sat at the very top of the social register. The Woodward family wealth at that point ran to around $10 million, equivalent today to roughly $120 million, and their fortune included not only the bank, but the Belair Stud farm in Maryland, the leading thoroughbred breeding operation in the United States. The family stable had produced Gallant Fox, who in 1930 had won the Triple Crown. The family stable had produced Omaha, who in 1935 had won it again. The family stable was about to produce Nashua, who in 1955 would be sold for $1,251,000, then the highest price ever paid for a thoroughbred. The Woodwards were not merely rich, they were dynastically rich, racing rich, Newport rich. William and Anne met at the Fitzpatrick Hotel. He told his friends he intended to marry her. His mother told him he intended no such thing. He married Anne at a quiet wartime ceremony in 1943. Elsie Woodward did not attend the wedding. For the next 12 years, the marriage was the visible drama of the Woodward household. From the outside, the Woodwards were perfect. They had two sons, William III, called Woody, born in 1944, and James, born in 1947. They moved between an apartment in Manhattan, the family estate at Oyster Bay on Long Island called the Playhouse, the family seat at Belair in Maryland, and the Newport house in Season. Anne was photographed at the Belmont. Anne was photographed at the Travers. Anne was dressed by Maine Boucher. Anne had a presentation set of pearls Elsie had not given her, but which the columnists assumed had come from the family. Inside, the marriage was a war of attrition. Elsie Woodward had not accepted Anne at the wedding, and she did not accept her in the 12 years that followed. The senior Mrs. Woodward referred to her daughter-in-law in private as the chorus girl. She made it clear to William that the family fortune would be controlled, on her own death and on her husband's, in such a way that Anne would never have direct access to the capital. Anne lived on an allowance. Anne's allowance came from Elsie. Elsie did not increase it. Anne began to drink. She drank in the morning. She drank at lunch. She drank through the long Newport afternoons. William drank with her. They fought. They fought in front of the servants. They fought in front of Capote, who, in those years, was beginning to appear on the edges of the Woodward circle, and who watched everyone with the small, intelligent eyes of a child who had been promised nothing and intended to take everything. By the summer of 1955, the marriage had a third active person inside it. Her name was Princess Marina Torlonia, a granddaughter of the Italian banking family, and a young woman of considerable beauty. William had begun an affair with her in Rome that spring. Anne had discovered it. The discovery had been one of the precipitating events of a confrontation that summer at a private dinner party in the Bahamas, at which William had reportedly said, in front of half a dozen witnesses, that he intended to leave Anne at the end of the season. Anne told her closest friend at the Bahamian dinner that he would not be leaving anyone. She did not say what she meant. She did not perhaps know herself yet what she meant. By October, the Woodwards were back at the Playhouse at Oyster Bay, and on the night of the 29th of October, 1955, they were due to attend a dinner at the home of George and Edith Baker. The Playhouse had a long upstairs hall. The bedrooms of the two spouses faced each other across that hall. On the night of the 28th of October, a recent series of burglaries on Long Island's North Shore had led both Woodwards, on the local police's advice, to place loaded shotguns in their bedrooms. It would later be said that this was the moment the marriage's outcome was sealed. It was not the shotguns. It was the architecture of the upstairs hall. The bedrooms faced each other. Either spouse could see the other's door at any hour. The dinner at the Bakers was uneventful. The Woodwards drove home. They went to their separate rooms. They did not see one another alive again. Chapter 5. The Princess and the Prowler. By the autumn of 1955, every dinner party in Manhattan knew about William Woodward's affair with Princess Marina Torlonia and the Bahamian confrontation that almost ended his marriage. The columnists knew. Walter Winchell knew. Charlie Knickerbocker knew. Truman Capote, who was in those years moving slowly from observer to participant inside the Woodward and Cushing circles, knew in greater detail than anyone outside the household. He had a notebook. He had a small leather book with a black cover. He was writing down what he heard. The Bahamian dinner had taken place in early September at the Lyford K residence of an English banking family. William had drunk heavily. Princess Torlonia had been seated at the same long table. Anne had watched the seating arrangement and had marked the geography of it. In the small hours of the morning, on the veranda, William had reportedly told an old Harvard friend that he intended to ask Anne for a divorce in the autumn. The friend had relayed the conversation, as friends did then, to a third party. The third party had relayed it to Anne. She drank for 3 days. She went swimming at the wrong times. She telephoned a doctor she knew in New York and asked about the procedures for a contested divorce in the state of New York. The doctor referred her to a lawyer. The lawyer was a member of the same Newport set as Elsie Woodward. The conversation about the divorce did not, by any subsequent account, proceed in private. By the end of September, the Woodward family was facing the prospect of a public divorce and the press contest it would entail. It would have cost the family more than money. It would have cost them position. The Princess Torlonia connection in particular was a problem the columns would not have left alone. The princess was Catholic. William was an Episcopalian Protestant of the most Protestant kind. The senior Woodwards, Elsie and the late William Sr., who had died only the previous summer, had built their position on a public morality that did not survive that kind of headline. Elsie understood this clearly. Anne understood it less clearly, but understood it. The Long Island burglary epidemic gave the autumn its peculiar shape. A man called Paul Worths, a German immigrant of slight build and a long record, had been moving through the North Shore that month, breaking into the houses of the rich and stealing small portable items, jewelry, cash, occasionally a service revolver. There had been 7 burglaries in 3 weeks. The Nassau County police had advised householders to keep firearms in their bedrooms. The Bakers had a shotgun. The Phippses had a shotgun. The Whitneys had a shotgun. The Woodwards, whose previous habit had been to keep their guns in a locked cabinet downstairs, had placed 2 12-gauge shotguns in the 2 bedrooms at the Playhouse on the night of the 28th of October. The dinner at the Bakers on the 29th was a small one, about a dozen guests. The Woodwards arrived on time. They sat at separate ends of the table. Anne drank steadily. William drank steadily. The conversation turned at one point to the burglaries. William was reported to have said that if a prowler came through his door, he would shoot first and ask questions in the morning. Anne was reported to have said nothing. They left at 10:30. They drove home in silence. They went to their separate bedrooms across the upstairs hall. Anne was wearing her nightgown and had her shotgun on the night table beside her bed. William was wearing pajamas and had his shotgun against the inside wall of his bedroom. The household staff had been dismissed for the night. Capote, who was not present, would later imagine the rest of the night in such detail that he would not, in the end, be able to publish it. What is documented is the sound. At a little after 2 in the morning, a noise woke Anne. She would later say it was the sound of a door opening. She picked up the shotgun. She walked to the door of her bedroom. She opened it. The hallway was unlit. She saw a figure in the corridor. She fired. The shot at close range from a 12-gauge shotgun was catastrophic. William Woodward Junior took the full charge in the upper chest and died at the scene. He was wearing pajamas. He was holding nothing in his hands. He had walked the length of the hallway from his own bedroom to the door of his wife's. There was no prowler in the house. There was never a prowler in the house that night. The German burglar Paul Wirths was eventually arrested for several of the burglaries, but he was nowhere near Oyster Bay on the night of the 29th of October, 1955. Anne telephoned her mother-in-law. She did not telephone the police first. She telephoned Elsie Woodward. What Elsie did in the next 4 hours would decide the next 20 years of Anne's life. Chapter 6. The Shot in the Hallway. At a little after 2 in the morning, on the 30th of October, 1955, Anne Woodward fired a 12-gauge shotgun at a figure in the corridor and called the police. The order of those events is the heart of the case. She did not call the police first. By her own testimony, she called her mother-in-law first, and by the testimony of the household staff who came running from the servants' quarters, within minutes, she was speaking on the telephone to Elsie Woodward when the first staff member reached her. The police were called by the Woodward family solicitor, a senior partner at the firm of Cravath, Swain, and Moore, who arrived at the playhouse before the local police did. By the time the Nassau County police reached the scene, at around 3 in the morning, the Woodward family solicitor was on the property. The family doctor was on the property. Elsie Woodward, who lived in Manhattan, was already in a car with her driver heading to Long Island. The detectives from the Nassau County Police Department who attended the scene were experienced men. The lead detective was a sergeant called Joseph Saracino. He took Anne's statement that night, in the presence of her solicitor. The statement was simple. She had heard a noise. She had thought it was a prowler. She had taken the shotgun from her night table. She had walked to her bedroom door. She had opened it. She had seen a figure in the corridor. She had fired. She had not known it was her husband. The physical evidence at the scene was consistent with the account, but also consistent with other accounts. William had been shot at close range, from a distance of around 6 feet, with the shotgun pointed level. The location of the body was just outside Anne's bedroom door. He was wearing pajamas. His own shotgun remained in his bedroom on the opposite side of the corridor. He had been crossing the hall to his wife's room. There was no forensic evidence of an intruder. There were no broken windows. There was no forced entry. The doors of the playhouse had been locked when the police arrived. The dogs had not barked. The staff had heard no entry. The only people in the house when the shot was fired were the Woodwards themselves. Within hours, the press were on the story. The New York Times sent its night editor's deputy. The New York Daily News sent 2 reporters. By the morning of the 30th of October, the photographers were on the lawn. The Nassau County District Attorney, a careful man called Frank Galata, was on the telephone with Elsie Woodward's lawyer. The press call he made that afternoon described the death as a tragic accident under investigation. He did not announce that charges were being considered. He did not announce that charges were not being considered. Elsie Woodward took control of the next phase. She moved Anne into her own apartment in Manhattan. She arranged for the Woodward family doctor to provide a course of sedation. She arranged for the 2 grandsons, Woody and James, to be taken out of school and placed with their grandmother. She arranged for the family solicitor to liaise with the district attorney's office. She did not appear in public. She did not give interviews. She did not, by any record, raise her voice. The German burglar Paul Wirths was arrested in the following weeks. He confessed to a series of burglaries on the North Shore. He had not, however, been at the playhouse on the night of the 29th. The defense that emerged from the Woodward family's preparation was nonetheless built around the prowler. The argument was that Anne had reasonably believed there was an intruder in her house, that she had been a frightened woman in fear of her life, and that the killing of her husband had been the tragic consequence of a misidentification in a dark hallway. The grand jury was impaneled on the 25th of November, 1955. It sat in private, as American grand juries do. The witnesses included Anne, the Woodward staff, the police detectives, and the family physician. The foreman of the grand jury was a businessman from Garden City, whose firm did extensive work with Hanover National Bank. He was not removed from the panel. The district attorney did not ask for an indictment. The grand jury returned a no true bill. Anne was free. The press was furious. The columns were skeptical. The Newport set was unconvinced. But the legal question was closed. There would be no trial. There would be no further investigation. The case file at Nassau County was marked closed in late December 1955. Truman Capote watched the closing of the case from a small armchair in the apartment of one of his swans. He took out his notebook with the black cover. He wrote the name Anne Hopkins. He wrote the line that would, 20 years later, kill her. That is the second verdict the world was never allowed to deliver. The third was about to be prepared 11 years later, on a different island, by a different fortune, against a man who would not even be given the dignity of an inquest. Chapter 7. The Richest Girl in the World and Her Designer. Eduardo Tirella came to Doris Duke through Peggy Lee and Elizabeth Arden, the way most of her closest collaborators came, through someone she trusted. Doris Duke had been the richest girl in the world since her father died in 1925. James Buchanan Duke, founder of the American Tobacco Company and the Duke Endowment, had left her around $80 million at his death, equivalent today to roughly $1.5 billion. She had been 12. The headlines that morning had used the phrase that would follow her for the rest of her life. She had grown up understanding two things: that she was famous for being rich, and that everyone she met would, eventually, want something from her. She had married twice, and both marriages had failed. The first, in 1935, to James Cromwell, an American politician, had ended in a public and bitter divorce in 1943. The second, in 1947, to the Dominican diplomat Porfirio Rubirosa, had lasted 13 months. By the 1960s, she had stopped marrying. She lived between four houses. Duke Farms in Somerville in New Jersey sat on around 2,700 acres. Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, sat on around 11 acres of cliffs above the sea. Shangri-La on Black Point Road in Honolulu sat above the Pacific. Falcon's Lair in Beverly Hills had been Rudolph Valentino's home. She moved between them with a staff that numbered, across all four properties, several hundred people. She paid them well. She kept them close. She trusted very few of them. Eduardo Tirella was different. He was 40 years old when she met him in the early 1960s. He was a New Jersey-born interior designer who had served as a Marine in the Pacific during the Second World War, and had come out of the service with a confidence that was rare in his industry. He had worked for Peggy Lee. He had worked for Elizabeth Arden. He had a small but respected gallery practice in Beverly Hills. He was warm. He was funny. He was openly gay in a way that the 1960s American social establishment did not yet entirely permit. He had a good eye. He had a better mouth. He could disagree with Doris Duke without flinching, and she liked that. He began working for her at Shangri-La in 1962. The Honolulu estate housed her growing collection of Islamic art, then the most significant private collection of its kind in the United States. Tirella worked with her on the placement of the pieces. He worked with her on the gardens. He worked with her on the design of the rooms that would house specific works. He stayed for months at a time. He became one of the closest people in her life. By 1965, he was working with her at Rough Point. The Newport estate had been bought by her father in 1922 from the Vanderbilts. It was a great stone house on the cliffs at the southern end of Bellevue Avenue. It was, in Newport terms, one of the seats. Doris was reshaping the gardens. She was reshaping the interiors. She was also, that year, beginning to plan what would become the Newport Restoration Foundation, an organization that would buy and restore around 80 colonial-era buildings in Newport over the following decade. The foundation was her work. The aesthetic vision was her work. The execution would be Tirella's. They were photographed together that year at Rough Point. The photographs survive. Doris is in casual clothes. Tirella is in casual clothes. They are standing in the garden looking at something off to the right of the frame. Her expression is open. His is amused. The two of them in those photographs are the closest thing to a working partnership Doris Duke ever had with another person. The intimacy did not have a category. They were not lovers. He was not her employee in the conventional sense. He was not her partner either, in any way the law would have recognized. What he was in the small private vocabulary of the very rich was a fixture. He was the person she expected to be in the next room. He was the person who could finish her sentences about a piece of fabric. He was the person who knew where she had put a particular set of keys. That summer of 1965, he traveled with her between Honolulu and Newport. He came to Duke Farms. He came to Falcon's Lair. He drove her car. He approved her shopping. He sat next to her at dinner. He carried, in the small way that people in her circle carried things, a quiet authority that came from being trusted by her. He was also, in the autumn of 1965, beginning to be courted by Hollywood. A producer he had worked with on a Peggy Lee project had begun discussing a film career for him, possibly as an art director, possibly as a production designer. He took the conversation seriously. He had been doing rich people's houses for 15 years. He was 41. He was beginning to want a public name of his own. He did not at first tell Doris. When he did tell her, in the early summer of 1966, the conversation did not go the way he had hoped. Chapter 8. The Job Offer from Los Angeles. In the late summer of 1966, Eduardo Tirella told Doris Duke he was leaving her household for a film career offer in Los Angeles. He had received a firm offer that summer, a studio production, a credit, a salary, a chance to do public work under his own name. He believed by every later account from people he had spoken to about it that he could make Doris understand. He believed she would be supportive. He believed that 30 years of accumulated trust between them would translate into a generous parting. She did not see it that way. She had spent her life being left, in small and large ways, by people whose attention she had paid for. She had seen 2 marriages collapse. She had seen friends drift. She had seen lovers go. She had developed an instinctive procedure for the moment a person announced that they were leaving her household. The procedure was cold and immediate and complete. The person left. The household closed behind them. They were not, in the small, precise vocabulary of her own staff, missed. The summer of 1966 was the summer in which that procedure was being prepared for Eduardo Tirella. He continued to work with her at Rough Point. They continued to plan the gardens. They continued to plan the restoration of the colonial-era houses on Easton's Point. But the conversations between them had changed. The staff noticed. The household noticed. By September, the air in the house had the quality that her household always had when she was preparing to end something. The 7th of October, 1966, was a clear, cool day on the coast of Rhode Island. Tirella and Duke had been at Rough Point all afternoon. They had taken a meeting with the architect working on one of the Easton's Point houses. They had taken a phone call from the Newport Police Department about a routine security matter. By around 5 in the afternoon, they were ready to leave. Tirella was driving Doris into Newport to meet a friend. The car was a rented 1966 Dodge Polara station wagon. It was a heavy vehicle. It was rented because Doris's own cars were being serviced. Tirella drove it. Doris sat in the passenger seat. The driveway at Rough Point ran from the house to a tall iron gate that closed onto Bellevue Avenue. The gate was operated manually from the outside. To leave the property, someone had to get out of the car, walk to the gate, push the bolt, and pull the leaf of the gate inward. The path of the driveway from the parking apron in front of the house to the gate was a straight line of approximately 140 feet. The gate sat in a stone wall that ran along Bellevue Avenue. The staff watched the car pull out from the front of the house. Tirella drove the short distance to the gate, stopped the car, and got out. Doris remained in the passenger seat. Tirella walked to the gate. He pulled the bolt. He began to swing the gate inward. It was at this moment that Doris slid across the bench seat to the driver's position. By the testimony of the only witness who could see the scene from the house, a member of the kitchen staff who had walked into the front pantry to put away a jug, the car was at this point stationary, with the driver's door open and Tirella at the gate. It is then unaccounted for whether the gate was fully open or whether it was still being opened. What is not unaccounted for is the result. The car accelerated. It traveled the distance from the parking apron to the gate at a speed that the surviving photographs and the position of the body would later be reconstructed at around 20 to 30 miles per hour. It struck Tirella as he stood by the gate. It carried him through the gate. It carried him across Bellevue Avenue. It pinned him against the stone wall on the far side of the avenue and against the rear of the gate that the impact had carried with him. The vehicle came to rest with its front end embedded in the wall. Eduardo Tirella was crushed. His pelvis was destroyed, his skull was fractured, his chest was caved in. He died within minutes at the scene. Doris Duke climbed out of the car. She was not seriously injured. She walked across the street. She looked at the body. She returned to the car. She drove the wagon back across Bellevue Avenue to the gate. She did not telephone an ambulance. She telephoned her own house. The household telephoned the Newport Police Department. The Newport Police Department dispatched officers and the chief of police, Joseph A. Radice. That phone call set in motion the closing of the case. Chapter 9. The Gate, the Wall, and the Police Chief. On the property. The station wagon crossed the distance from the driveway to the gate in less time than a slipped foot can explain, and Eduardo Tirella was crushed against the stone wall behind it. The Newport Police Department arrived at Rough Point at around 5:30 in the afternoon. The body was where the car had left it. The car was where Doris had reparked it. The first officers on the scene took photographs. The photographs survive. They show the wagon at the gate, the body across the road, the damage to the stone wall, the broken iron leaf of the gate. They also show, in the background of one of the frames, a senior figure in plain clothes standing on the lawn at Rough Point, in conversation with a Duke household staff member. The figure has been identified in the 2020 reinvestigation by the journalist Peter Lance as Chief Joseph A. Radice. Chief Radice's presence on the lawn that afternoon is the central forensic problem of the Tirella case. The Chief of Police of Newport, Rhode Island, in 1966, did not customarily attend traffic accidents in person. The Chief of Police of Newport, Rhode Island, in 1966, did customarily attend, in person, any incident that involved Doris Duke. The two things were not the same. The presence of the chief at the scene, before the investigation had even formally opened, was itself a small ceremony of social precedence. It was the network arriving on the lawn. The interview with Doris Duke took place at the house, in her sitting room, with her household solicitor present. It lasted approximately 20 minutes. She gave a statement. Her foot had slipped from the brake to the accelerator. She had been moving to the driver's seat to bring the car closer to the gate so that Tirella, who was tired, would not have to walk back to the parking apron. The car had jumped forward. She had not known what had happened until it was over. She had been deeply shocked. She had not been able to think clearly. She had reparked the car only because she did not know what else to do. The statement was accepted. No further interview was conducted. No reconstruction of the scene was attempted at the time. The vehicle was towed away. The body was removed. The case was treated from that first afternoon as a tragic accident. The official investigation lasted 5 days. The Newport Police Department closed the file on the 12th of October 1966 with a finding of accidental death. The district attorney accepted the finding. No grand jury was impaneled, no charges were considered, no inquest was held. The Tirella family was not contacted for compensation. Eduardo Tirella's mother in New Jersey learned of her son's death from a friend who had read it in the paper. What follows is the part that took 54 years. The Vanity Fair piece by Peter Lance, published in June 2020, was the result of 3 years of work. Lance had obtained the original Newport Police Department photographs of the scene. He had obtained Radice's datebook. He had obtained the staff testimonies that had not been entered into the original investigation. He had retained an accident reconstruction specialist to analyze the physical evidence. The reconstruction concluded that the vehicle had traveled at a speed inconsistent with a slipped foot, that the distance from the parking apron to the gate was too long for the car to have reached that speed by accident, and that the position of the body, the gate, and the wall was consistent with the vehicle having been driven, not slipped, into Tirella. The Newport Police Department, under a new chief, reopened the case in October 2020. The reopening concluded that the original ruling was not supportable on the evidence available in the original photographs. No charges could be brought. Doris Duke had died in 1993, leaving an estate of around $1,300,000,000. The Duke endowment continued to disburse around $150 million a year. Eduardo Tirella's name was placed retrospectively on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2021. A small ceremony was held. His brother attended. There was no Duke representative. That is the third verdict the world was never allowed to deliver. To understand how all three were prepared, we have to step back from the killings themselves and look at the system that made them possible. We have to look at the network. Chapter 10. The Defense Money Could Buy. Mary Copley Thaw spent around $1 million across 9 years to keep her son out of the electric chair, and she succeeded in 1907. Her son, Harry Kendall Thaw, was the heir to a Pittsburgh railroad and coke fortune that had been built by his father, William Thaw, across the second half of the 19th century. By the early years of the 20th century, Harry was a frequent and increasingly violent presence in the New York entertainment world. He had, in the year 1905, married a young Broadway chorus girl called Evelyn Nesbit, who had previously been the close companion and apparent victim of the celebrated architect Stanford White. White was at that point one of the most famous public figures in the United States. The the designer of the Washington Square Arch, the Boston Public Library, and the second Madison Square Garden. On the evening of the 25th of June, 1906, at the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden, Harry Thaw walked up to the table at which Stanford White was sitting, drew a revolver, and shot him 3 times in the face. White died at the scene. Thaw was arrested immediately. He was charged with murder in the first degree. The first trial opened in January 1907. Mary Copley Thaw had retained Delphine Delmas, a Californian trial lawyer known for spectacular oratory, as lead counsel. She had also retained 2 of the most expensive alienists in the country to prepare an insanity defense. The defense had a name. It called itself Dementia Americana, the term Delmas coined to describe the temporary insanity of a husband who has discovered the seduction of his wife. The press, the public, and a sufficient portion of the jury found the theory compelling. The first trial ended in a hung jury on the 12th of April, 1907. The second trial opened in January 1908. Mary Copley Thaw had spent freely on press relations. The New York newspapers, with the exception of the Times, had largely come to a settlement with the defense narrative. The second jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity on the 1st of February 1908. Harry Thaw was committed to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. He did not stay there. He escaped to Canada in 1913. He was returned. He was retried for the escape and found, again, not guilty by reason of insanity. He was at last formally released in July 1915. He lived another 32 years. He attacked a young man with a horsewhip in 1917 and was committed again. He was released again. He died in Miami in 1947. Across the 9 years between the killing and the formal release, Mary Copley Thaw is reported to have spent approximately $1 million on her son's defense. The figure is equivalent today to around $30 million. It paid the trial lawyers, the alienists, the press placement, the appeals counsel, and the medical superintendents of the institutions in which Harry Thaw was, in name, confined. That is the machinery in its purest form, a great inherited fortune, deployed by the mother of a killer across 2 trials and a series of escapes and recommittals to produce a final outcome in which the killer walks. The legal system did not fail. The legal system performed exactly as designed. The defense bought every advantage the system allowed for, and the system delivered. Florence Bravo's family did not need to deploy this machinery to its full extent. The director of public prosecutions declined to bring charges. The work was done at the inquest stage. The result was the same. Anne Woodward's family did not need to deploy this machinery to its full extent either. The grand jury declined to indict. The result was the same. Doris Duke's household did not need to deploy this machinery at all. The Newport police closed the file. The result was the same. The Thaw case shows what the machinery can do when it has to work hardest. The other 3 cases show what happens when it does not have to work as hard. In all 4 cases, the machinery wins. That is the structural fact. The killer's freedom is not bought at the last possible moment in court. The killer's freedom is prepared in the years before the killing, in the structure of the household, in the long, quiet investment in the loyalty of the staff, the friendship of the doctors, the deference of the police, and the discretion of the press. We are about to look at the people who made that loyalty possible. Chapter 11. The Mothers-in-Law Who Stayed. Elsie Cryder. Woodward outlived her son, her daughter-in-law, and one of her grandsons, and she kept the family name spotless through every funeral. She was 98 years old when she died at her apartment in Manhattan in October 1981. She had been a fixture in New York society for almost 3/4 of a century. She had been on the social register since her marriage in 1904. She had been a senior figure on the boards of the Metropolitan Opera, the New York Public Library, and the Cushing Academy. She had attended every important Newport season from the Edwardian era until the late 1970s. She had been a friend of every senior figure in the East Coast establishment, from the Roosevelts to the Kennedys. She had also, by every account that the press has ever been able to obtain, never once in her life referred publicly to the events of the 29th of October, 1955, at the Playhouse at Oyster Bay. She did not give interviews. She did not write a memoir. She did not, in the long, quiet correspondence with her remaining friends, ever discuss the death of her only son in any terms other than as a tragic accident. She gave the public no other story. She made it impossible for the press to find an alternative narrative inside the family. She was, in the small, precise vocabulary of the social establishment she had ruled for so long, the gatekeeper. She also, across the 20 years between Anne Woodward's grand jury and her own death, paid an allowance to her daughter-in-law. The allowance kept Anne fed, housed, and clothed. It also kept her dependent. Anne had no capital of her own. The allowance came from Elsie. Elsie set the terms. When Truman Capote published the relevant excerpt of Answered Prayers in Esquire magazine in November 1975, Anne Woodward took a seconal overdose 3 days before the issue reached newsstands. She was 60 years old. Elsie's response to the suicide, reported by the senior journalist Anthony Holden in the Sunday Times, was the single line that has come to define the case. She did it for our sake, and at last we are at peace. Florence Bravo's mother, Anne Campbell, did similar work in a quieter idiom. She declined every press request after the second inquest. She moved her daughter to Southsea. She retained a senior London solicitor to manage the press fallout. She maintained, until her own death in 1885, that her daughter had been the victim of a household tragedy and not its author. She kept the Campbell family name out of the columns. She did not, in the time between Florence's death and her own, ever publicly use the name James Manby Gully. Doris Duke's late mother had died in 1962. The mother-in-law role at the time of the Tirella killing was occupied, in a sense, by Duke's senior household staff and by her senior estate manager, the lawyer Edward Hanley. They closed the case within 5 days. They paid for the funeral. They did not contact the Tirella family in New Jersey. They moved Duke to Falcon's Lair within the month. They kept the press at the wall of the property. They did the work that, in the Woodward and Bravo cases, had been done by mothers-in-law. The pattern is the network's senior layer. Every great old money family in every one of these cases had a senior figure or set of senior figures whose first and most consistent obligation was the family name. The senior layer was not the killer. The senior layer was the killer's permission. Without it, the killings would have produced different outcomes. This pattern did not end with Doris Duke. In 1980, Martha Sharp Crawford von Bulow, known as Sunny, the wealthy American heiress of a Pittsburgh utility fortune, was found in an irreversible coma at her Newport house. Her husband, Klaus von Bulow, was tried twice for attempted murder by insulin injection. He was acquitted on retrial in 1985 after the deployment of a defense team funded from his wife's estranged family connections and from the inheritance she could no longer guard. The case fits the pattern. The senior layer of the von Bulow side of the family did the work. The press was managed. The verdict was not guilty. The pattern did not end with the von Bulows either. We are not yet at the end of it. Chapter 12. What we do not remember. We remember Florence and Anne and Doris because their names sat at the top of the columns, but the people who decided their freedom were the ones whose names never appeared. We remember Florence Bravo because the inquest reporters at the Bedford Hotel filled 23 days of the Times and the Daily Telegraph with her name. We do not remember the senior coroner who guided the questions, or the director of public prosecutions who declined to bring charges, or the family solicitor who retained the senior London counsel that ran the inquest defense. We do not remember Anne Campbell, who moved her daughter to Southsea and let the press lose interest. We do not remember the household staff, who carried what they had seen at the Priory to their graves. We remember Anne Woodward because Capote wrote her name into the longest piece of literary gossip in 20th century American letters. We do not remember the foreman of the Nassau County grand jury, whose firm did extensive work with Hanover National Bank. We do not remember Sergeant Saracino, who took the first statement. We do not remember the senior partner at Cravath, who arrived at the playhouse before the police did. We do not remember the Bahamian dinner host who heard William's threat of divorce, or the friend who relayed it to Anne, or the lawyer who took her first call about a contested divorce, or the dozen other figures who knew, before the shotgun fired, that the marriage was failing in a way the family was not going to let proceed. We remember Doris Duke because she was the richest girl in the world before she was a teenager. We do not remember Chief Joseph Radice, who stood on the lawn at Rough Point before the investigation had formally opened. We do not remember Edward Hanley, who closed the case within 5 days. We do not remember the district attorney's office, which accepted the closure without question. We do not remember the photographers who took the original scene photographs and let them sit in a filing cabinet for 54 years. We do not remember the network because the network never asked to be remembered. That is the substance of its work. It does its work in the silence between the killing and the verdict. It does its work at dinner tables and on lawns and on the long telephone calls that begin late at night and end early in the morning. It is staffed by people whose loyalty has been bought over a generation, sometimes longer, through the slow accumulation of small obligations, a child's tuition paid, a doctor's practice supported, a mortgage handled, an inheritance arranged, a job given to a brother-in-law, a season at Newport made possible. By the time the killing happens, the obligations have all been settled. The network does not need to be asked. This is the question the channel asks again and again. It is the question the viewer has to answer. We have built the entire shape of our public morality around the trial. We have built it around the jury, the verdict, the press, the spectacle. We have not built it around the network. The network does not sit in a courtroom. The network does not give evidence. The network does not ordinarily speak. The network has no public face. We do not, in the conventional sense, hold it accountable. We hold the killer accountable. We never get to the network. Florence Bravo's name has been carried through 150 years. The names of the men and women at the Bedford Hotel who let the jury return willful murder by person or persons unknown have not. Anne Woodward's name has been carried through 70 years. The names of the people at the Nassau County District Attorney's Office who let the grand jury decline to indict have not. Doris Duke's name will be carried through any number of years to come. The names of the people who stood on the lawn at Rough Point on the afternoon of the 7th of October, 1966, have already begun to fade. This is what the wealth bought. It did not buy comfort. It did not buy taste. It did not buy the long, quiet country house weekends and the diamonds and the carriages. Or rather, it bought those things, but they were not the deepest purchase. The deepest purchase was the silence of the network. The deepest purchase was the loyalty that meant that, when a killing happened inside the fortune, the people who could have spoken did not speak. The deepest purchase was the consent of the doctor, the butler, the police chief, the grand juryman, the columnist, and the mother-in-law. That is the story old money tells about itself. That is the story this channel exists to interrupt. We will not ordinarily get to convict the killer. The trial is closed, the verdict is rendered, the body is buried, the legal record is fixed. But we can perhaps refuse the second purchase. We can refuse the silence. We can name the network. We can hold it in the only way that is left to us, to the small and stubborn accountability of a clear public account. That is the work. It is unglamorous. It does not satisfy the desire for justice that the killing itself provokes. It is, instead, the slow, stubborn business of remembering the people who were paid to forget. 3 marriages, 3 deaths, 3 verdicts the world was never allowed to deliver, and in each of them, a network of human beings who decided, quietly, that the family name was worth more than the truth. We can decide otherwise. That is what they did not, in the end, manage to buy. If you stayed with me to the end of this one, hit subscribe so the next story comes to you the moment it is ready, and drop a comment with where you are watching from, and which of the 3 cases, Florence Bravo, Anne Woodward, or Doris Duke, felt the most familiar to a network you have seen.